idea behind this automaticity juggernaut. And I'm here to tell you that the evidence for automaticity just is not there. Okay? Nevertheless, it's a view that is very, very, very prominent. One more example of this, which gets us into the topic of free will, I suppose. Dan Wegner, I mentioned his name before. Late Dan Wegner was a psychologist at Harvard University. Wrote a book entitled The Illusion of Conscious Will, which is basically predicated on and exemplifies the automaticity juggernaut, in which he argues that conscious will, conscious intention, conscious thought is not responsible for our behavior, but that the real causal mechanisms underlying behavior are never present in consciousness. The engines of causation operate without revealing themselves to us, and so may be unconscious mechanisms of mind. And then goes on just to state it again, the real causes of human action are unconscious, okay? Behavior arises without the person having any conscious insight into its causation. In case anybody didn't get it, Wegner includes a diagram in which he traces how there is an apparent causal path between conscious thought and conscious action, but that is only an apparent causal path. In fact, our conscious thoughts are determined by unconscious causes of our thoughts, and in fact, our conscious actions are determined by unconscious causes of action, and that these are the actual causal paths. Again, it's basically a restatement of the idea that thought and action occur automatically and unconsciously. Wegner bases a lot of his argument on a very famous experiment in physiological psychology known as the Libet experiment, which makes use of what's known as the readiness potential. For those of you who had a little bit of psychophysiology, the readiness potential is something that you could observe in the electroencephalogram, and it's a particular signal in the electroencephalogram that occurs when subjects respond to various kinds of stimuli. And there's a fuller explanation of this in the lecture supplements. I don't want to go through all that detail right now. But in general, what happens in an experiment is that if some stimulus event occurs, your brain responds with this particularly shaped the signal, looks just like this, that has various components to it that reflect the brain's processing of that signal. Now, that's true when the signal is something that occurs in the external environment, but it turns out to be also true when the signal is something that occurs in the internal environment. What these investigators discovered, Kornhuber and Decky discovered, was that if you put people into an experiment in which their EEG is being recorded and they're simply asked to lift their finger, okay, anytime they want, just lift their finger, make a simple voluntary motor action, that shortly before they actually lift their finger, you see a signal like this, what Kornhuber and Decky called the readiness potential. It is a response to an internal signal, if you will, and they interpret it as, more or less as the following. At some point, the subject has the wish to raise his finger. That wish is marked by the readiness potential, and then he goes off and raises his finger. What Libet did was to do a variant of this experiment in which subjects were asked to watch a clock whose hands were spinning very quickly around the circumference, and to mark, in terms of this special clock, what time it was when they decided to lift their finger. Okay? So that was basically to try to figure out whether the readiness potential occurred before or after this conscious wish. The thing is revolving very, very, very fast, but people can do this. And it turned out that what Libet observed in his experiment was that there were particularly interesting features of timing, that the person's awareness of the desire to move his finger occurred about 200 milliseconds before he actually moved his finger. Okay? But the readiness potential occurred about 350 milliseconds before the person's desire to move his finger. Okay? What Libet basically concluded from that is that the readiness potential is an unconscious signal, okay, and that the person's conscious awareness of his desire to move his finger is essentially an afterthought. Here's the data from Libet's experiment. Here we have the person actually lifting his finger right here. About 150 to 200 milliseconds before, you get the person's awareness of the wish, okay? But here, you get this readiness potential occurring about 350 milliseconds before that. The conclusion from this is that the desire to move the finger arises unconsciously, and then the conscious desire to move a finger is essentially an afterthought. On the basis of this, Libet, Wegner, large numbers of other investigators have concluded that free will is simply an illusion, okay? That we might have thought that our conscious desire to lift the finger caused our finger to lift, but it doesn't, okay? It goes on beforehand. This is a very controversial experiment, but I have to tell you, there have been many replications of the experiment. If you do what Libet did, you get what he gets. There's some variability around it, but basically all these experiments produce exactly the same kinds of findings. To make a very long story short, because I'm running out of time, there was recently noticed a huge confound in this experiment, okay, which is that the subjects have to decide to lift their fingers and watch the clock at the same time, okay? Now, Jeff Miller at the University of Otago in New Zealand reran this experiment in which he compared subjects in two conditions. One in which they just lift their finger, and another one in which they watch the clock while they lift the finger. And to make a long story even shorter, when you eliminate the clock watching, the unconscious readiness potential disappears from the data. Libet's findings are a complete artifact of the fact that he asked his subjects to watch the clock while they were engaging in this task. If they do exactly the same task without watching the clock, you don't see this pre-decisional shift in the EEG at all. Not at all. It's just gone, okay? So, with Wegner and with others, the Libet experiment is the first piece of evidence for the illusion of conscious will. We now know that the Libet experiment is a complete artifact of Libet's method, okay? So maybe we have free will, maybe we don't have free will, but the literature on automaticity comparing the power of controlled and cognitive processes doesn't say we don't, and neither does the Libet experiment. That's it for automaticity. Next week we'll take up the problem of unconscious mental life. Thanks very much. Sorry to keep you a little late.